everyone, and welcome back to another episode of 18Xonomics, a cardboard reality podcast centered around heavy economic games and the 18XX genre. I'm your host, Joel Mosier. Today, I bring on a very unlikely guest, Scott, to talk about 18AL. We recently played that, and you might have heard or read a little bit of my thoughts on it in our recent high five, where I had the down low, and I talked about how it wasn't really the greatest experience because we'd already dove too deep into 18XX. So I wanted to bring Scott on to talk about his experience as his first 18XX, and there's kind of a surprising thing that you find out pretty early on. So pretty excited about that. We kind of wrap up the episode talking about a little bit of war games. Just because Scott, I promised Scott since he played 18XX, I'd play a war game. So without further ado, enjoy the show.
Hey there, everyone. Today I'm joined by someone who you probably thought would never be on this podcast. Scott, how's it going?
It's going pretty good, Joel. I also never thought I'd be on this podcast.
I kind of was a little bit surprised that you agreed to do it. I'm not going to lie. So today we're going to kind of talk about Scott's first little intro into 18XX. Well, probably his only game of 18XX, but we'll see. See if we can convince him to play another one, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. So you've heard about it a little bit. We played 18AL with the four of us on the podcast, and it was an interesting experience. I talked about it a little bit on the down low, in our written segment with the high five. So it didn't quite go as well for me as I would have hoped from an 18XX experience, but I'm curious, Scott, what did you think?
Well, that is a very good question, and that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Yep.
So, I mean, all right, I'm just going to go ahead and say this right off the bat. I would be willing to play another 18XX game, probably.
Okay. All right.
You could convince me to play like another intro game.
All right.
I was expecting it to be heavier, honestly.
Okay. Yeah. I can see that.
It was easier to grasp than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, we've talked about it a little bit, but the concepts in each individual mechanic inside of an 18XX is very simple. I mean, route building, pretty straightforward. When you're auctioning off the privates, I mean, auctions are usually pretty easy. I mean, you're just buying stock. I mean, a lot of the mechanics themselves are very straightforward. It's more the strategy behind that, and that gets a lot deeper after 4 or 5 plays of a particular 18XX, because some of them really seem to, they get a little bit deeper after that many plays, just because there are strategies that you may not see with the way that the stock market kind of moves and each particular company and how it kind of plays out. But 18AL doesn't quite have that type of meat on it, as Herb likes to say, or likes to talk about levers to pull in 18XX games. 18AL just doesn't really have those. And so if you haven't heard of 18XX, it's basically just train games, which if you haven't heard of 18XX and you're listening to our podcast, this might be your first time. So, because we talk about it a lot, or at least I do, and Nick does quite a bit as well. But the main premise is just you're running a train company and building routes and things like that, and not really a theme that Scott usually tends to enjoy.
Right.
He tends to enjoy more of the themes maybe in this shelf or behind, or even further behind the shelf that may not be actually in the frame, but
over here somewhere. I don't know if you can see that.
Yep. So, yeah, more into the war games, which, warring rail barons. I don't know, making up games on the spot here. So, So I kind of got a couple questions for Scott here, just kind of talking about, because I've talked about 18xx plenty. You know how I kind of feel about them. And if you go and read the download on our site, cardboardrealitypodcast.com, you can kind of hear more of my thoughts of the individual play of 18AL. But yeah, I mean, you kind of mentioned that you thought it was going to be heavier than it was. What part did you think might be heavier?
I just thought that there would be a lot more rules overhead.
Oh yeah.
Or like rules checking.
Yeah. You think it was going to be more like a heavy Euro where you're like, a 45-minute rules teach or something like Feudum or something crazy?
Yeah, basically.
Gotcha.
Which because the 18xx games, they're usually rated like as pretty heavy on BGG, aren't they?
Yeah. So I don't know that we've touched on that subject before, but it's something that I know we've talked about. I know Nick and I have kind of talked about in that it seems like the rating is by players who don't play a lot of 18xx, because I mean, honestly, I think 18AL should be rated in around a 3 probably, because it just doesn't seem that complex to me. But I mean, I'm sure somebody who's an 18xx expert would probably even disagree with me on that, in that maybe the mechanics in general are a little bit more more opaque or something than they seem to be. But I don't know. I feel like they just make sense in the way that everything's laid out and the way that the mechanics intertwine together.
Right. So it's kind of like the exact opposite of the problem that wargame weight ratings have on BGG.
Right? Yeah. You've got a really heavy war game and all the war gamers rate it so low that it's like, oh yeah, this will be an easy game to learn. And then it's like, it's not.
It's like, this is a 3 and it's like, oh, well, get ready for an hour teach and a 5-hour game.
Yep. So, I mean, there definitely are 18xx games that will have a bit more meat to them. Like 1849, you can't really see it. I kind of put this in the way, but, we've talked about before. I mean, on the first episode of this podcast with Nick, definitely a lot more levers to pull on that. Definitely a few more things to teach. A bit more of a brutal game just because of the way that you're trying to acquire, or the way you're trying to get money into each of your companies. So we've got another intro 18xx here, 1889. This is probably the one I would have preferred to introduce you to. But I'd been wanting to at least try 18AL, and I know Dylan was really more interested in trying that. And so that's one we ended up with. But I think 1889 has a little bit more to it, just a tiny bit more meat. It doesn't hold your hand as much,
right?
And I think that might be a bit more, not up your alley, but a bit more for you to chew on and maybe make a better decision as to whether or not 18xx is something that you might play on occasion. I'm sure it's never going to be like war games are for you, but
right.
If I see an 18xx on your shelf, I know something's wrong. So one of the other questions that I wanted to make sure I asked you, if I can unlock my phone here, Downey. So what were the, I was actually kind of surprised that you said it wasn't as heavy as you thought, or that you'd be interested in playing again. But what specifically were the kind of redeeming factors or mechanics that at least made you think about it later?
Well, so I mean, like I do like economic games a bit.
Yeah,
like I'll play those. Like I just played Chinatown at Origins with Dylan. I thought that was a pretty fun game.
Oh yeah.
With 18x, it's kind of more indirect than that. Like you're not usually bargaining directly with players, but you're still influencing them economically.
Yeah. And you could do a little bit of negotiation. It just doesn't necessarily mean that anybody's going to go with you on it like they're required to in Sidereal.
Right. Like it's not a negotiating game. It's an economic game.
Yeah.
Usually like stockholding isn't exactly my favorite mechanic.
Yeah. But
it is still kind of satisfying to like create good routes and, get good payouts. It's like a little Skinner box, you push the button, you give money.
Yep. That sounds about right. I mean, that's how you boil down all 18xx to. It's push a button, get money. That's pretty much it.
Right. Probably the weirdest thing, the weirdest part of my experience was near the end when you guys were like, all right, let's spreadsheet this. And then we just like simulated like the last like 4 rounds or something like that.
Yeah.
I was like, I've never played a game where you can do this.
Yeah. Right. Where it's just like, oh, so the rest of the game is just scripted out and we can just end it now. Yeah. That's definitely something that I know a lot of players we've kind of talked about on the Slack channel, particularly Dan. I know they do a lot of spreadsheet during the middle of the game, and then it speeds up a lot of things. And especially once you know kind of, okay, this is how things are going to shake out. This is how the trains are going to shake out. You can really start to spreadsheet things, especially once the routes get more solidified.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, that's definitely one of the nice parts, that when you know how the game's going to end, it's nice to be able to call it early, especially since I know, like, for Nick particularly, he doesn't like the longer ones nearly as much.
Right.
So it definitely can cut down on the playtime of those, like we did with 1844.
Right.
We kind of cut it early.
And that can be a downside for a lot of economic games where someone just crushes everyone else. And
right.
You know halfway through that they're going to win because they've snowballed, and then they're going to continue to do so.
Yeah. Which, I mean, that is something in 18XX where you can maybe have an idea of who might win, but even in our play, I thought it didn't come down to actually calculating it out, particularly, I think, Nick and Dylan, because Dylan ended up winning, I think, right?
I think so, yeah.
And so I think it was between Nick and Dylan as to who might win, but we weren't entirely sure. We thought it was probably going to be Dylan, but we weren't sure until we calculated it. And I think they actually ended up coming fairly close, maybe.
Right. I think that Dylan probably won because he didn't agree to not exploit my inexperience like you guys
Yeah,
did.
exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, I really didn't think the game was going to have that much kind of exploitative maneuvers where you're just like dumping parts of companies and stuff. But Dylan found a kind of a, not really a loophole. I mean, it's definitely there. It's present in all 18XX games basically, but he found the right time and the right, really just the right time to do it. It was, he dumped like 4 of your shares that he had owned or something, tanking your company and then buying into another company to be able to get a train. And that's the thing you do normally see in a lot of the heavier, or not heavier, but like the next step up from the beginner 18XX games. But I didn't think it was going to work as well as it did in 18AL, just because it seemed like it was holding it at that point in the game. Nick and I had really decided that the game was holding our hands so much, and like on hardcore training wheels, that we didn't think that, or at least I didn't think. Nick might have considered it, but I didn't think it was going to make that big of a difference, but it kind of turned out to, really.
Right. Until Dylan did that, everybody was at their stock limit, and so nobody could buy stocks.
Which that was a really weird experience too, because usually you don't hit your stock limit until, I mean, you will hit your stock limit usually before the end of the game, but usually it's like that last stock round, and then at that point you're almost spreadsheeting it like we did. But we were like 4 stock rounds away from before we ended up spreadsheeting it. It seemed a lot further away when we were at our stock limit. It felt very weird.
Right.
You definitely won't quite see that in 1889 if that's the next one that we convince you to jump into. So you said you like other economic games. How did it compare? I think Container is one of your more liked economic games, if I remember correctly.
It's like, so Container is, it's very different than 18XX.
Oh, for sure.
You're buying stuff and then you're setting prices on it to try to get other players to buy it from you.
Yeah.
And then, get everything to auction and for like set collection at the end.
Yeah.
I still think that I prefer something like Container over 18XX, at least based on my play with 18AL.
Yeah.
But like I do prefer something like 18AL over like a medium or heavyweight Euro generally. Like I would rate 18AL above Zolkin.
Okay. That makes sense.
I wasn't a huge fan of Zolkin, so that's not saying a
much,
lot, but I do prefer it over that.
Okay. So do you think it's the like closed economy type feel, or the kind of almost negotiation in Container that kind of separates it, or what do you think the difference is?
It's a bit of both. It's more like I do enjoy the negotiation aspect. Like I also I like Sidereal Confluence a lot, even though I'm not a huge fan of pushing cubes around. And like
that is the ultimate cube pusher. It's literally like these things turned into more of these things.
Right. Like it's a whole bunch of cube pushing like machines that you're collecting inside DRL. But I like it for the negotiation.
Yeah, for sure. Yep. I mean, that's definitely, I mean, it's in the title. We get it. Trading, negotiation, blah, blah, blah. But it really does distill down exactly, it really distills down negotiation into a very pure form, I feel like.
Right.
And kind of gives you a nice little, almost like a bow to wrap it in with the machines to push the cubes around, just to give you something to do with the negotiation rather than just
like
negotiate for nothing.
Everybody's trying to strike good deals for cubes that they can put in their cube converting machines.
Yep. For sure. So we covered a lot of the questions that I had, but I guess maybe so you said you'd play again, but what kind of interests you most? What would you like to get out of an 18XX experience more or less of?
Well, I still don't really feel like I know how to best approach like strategy in 18XX.
Okay.
I felt like I was kind of just doing like, well, this will make me a bit of money. And like, I'll make money if I do this.
Yeah.
But then like, it was just each turn, I was like, if I do these things, I'll make more than I spent.
Yeah.
And that's basically just what I did.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's probably the best way to start for sure.
Yeah. Instead of having like a long-term goal right off the bat or having like some tricky idea of what I'm going to do.
Yeah. I think the number one thing that most 18XX players talk about when they talk about strategy is you have to be planning early on where your permanent train is going to come from. Is it going to come from you starting a new company and using the capital from that to fund one of your company that already has good routes? Or are you just going to use the good routes from the company that you built early on that's had time to build good routes and then, buy the train with the new company and just let it use the same routes and token in certain places that make that more beneficial. But just that kind of planning out is where a lot of the strategy comes in, and manipulating turn order by selling and buying stock in certain. I know Lorcan has talked a lot about that on the Slack. That's something that I've considered we haven't explored nearly as much as I think we can.
And I mean, even in 18AL, there were some things that I saw that I hadn't considered before. Like, I think Nick started up a company and then used it to buy a train from his other company to give that one money.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, was Nick I think Nick might have been the only one until the very end when Dylan bought the other company that was remaining.
Right.
Nick was the only one up to that point to have two companies. And a lot of times in 18XX, having two companies is very good, just so that you can pass trains between them to manipulate either whether it's turn order because of you like pass the money back and forth, or if it's like where that train's going to come from. So then you know that, I'm just going to dump all the money and the trains from this company and then dump that company on somebody else and make them buy the train that it's going to need and things like that. It was definitely a softer 18AL was a softer experience in that regard, where dumping a company on someone didn't feel as viable of an option.
Right. Like even though Dylan dumped whatever the red company was on me, like it still pretty much recovered by the end. Yeah.
And that wasn't even, you already owned that. Like you had primary stock in that one, right?
Yeah.
And he just sold down to kind of tank your stock price and free up stock share limit for himself.
Right. I believe I had 6 and he had 4 in the company, and he sold all 4 at once.
Yep. It's definitely something to watch out for. A lot of people say that you don't want to buy stock in the person. You don't want to buy stock in a company of the person to your like right or something, because then if they're right before you in turn order, they just drop it right on you. So that's where it can get a little weird. And that's why, like when Dylan bought Hit, like he couldn't, if you didn't have primary, if you and I were tied for primary stock holder and I, or whatever, and he was actually the president, it would have dropped on you, for instance. And then you would, and if he manipulated things in certain ways, and that's where I didn't think that was as viable of an option to make somebody buy a train in 18AL, because it was just so almost
not slow, but the train rush wasn't as brutal as some games. And I'm sure your eyes are glazing over a little bit there. You're like, train rush, what? But yeah, maybe we'll get 1889 to table and bring you in on that, and maybe open your eyes a little bit more, make you give you some idea if you want to explore the system just a little bit more. But the one thing that I promised you, and I think this is something interesting to talk about for sure, is since you played an 18XX, and especially if you play a second one, I would play a war game of your choice. Have you made that decision, or you've got some ideas of what you want to make me play?
I've got some ideas. I don't want to try to force you to play something that I don't think you're going to like, because my goal is to convert you to the dark side.
Convert me to the dark side. That was my goal. How many dark sides are there? I don't know.
Apparently there's 2.
All right. So, so what are you thinking? Do you have like 2 or 3 in mind, or are you kind of narrowing it down, or?
Yeah. So, I mean, Nick's under the impression that you should play Polis, because that one is sort of not a war game. That's more of like an economic game with fighting.
Yeah.
I think that something like Maria or Friedrich would be a good one, because there's no dice rolls. It's about hand management.
Yeah.
So like with Maria, the board is split up into grids, which have suits, and the cards have suits. And that's where, and like if your army's in a grid with the matching suit, you spend those cards to add to your battle strength.
Gotcha. Okay.
And so like each turn you're going to be drawing cards, and you're trying to set up fights in places where, like, you know, you actually have cards that you can play towards it.
Yeah.
And the way that the game is split up amongst 3 people, it's balanced so that like you're usually fighting 2 different people, and you're trying to set it up so that way you don't fight them both
at the same time or something,
with like using the same resources.
Gotcha. Okay. Oh, so if you have like your hand split between, I'm just going to bank up random things, hearts and spades or something, you want to fight one with hearts and one with spades, or something, like, rather than trying to fight them both with hearts.
Right. You're going to try to set up fights where you can do that.
Gotcha. That sounds kind of, yeah, I could be intrigued in that. So what was the last thing I'll ask about 18XX? What was the biggest thing that was turning you off from the system?
Trains, man.
Trains, man. All right. So what about trains? I mean,
they just do not interest me at all. This is, I mean, it's 1800s train building, and also stock holding, and there's auctions sometimes.
Yep.
And so it's just like, I don't think I would be interested in that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's fair enough. So, I mean, I think that pretty much wraps up most of it. I mean, I can't think of anything else that would be good to ask you. I guess we'll just see if we've got another game of 18XX to talk about at some point.
I guess. And also, I will say, I guess you probably just need to take Dylan into that game as well, because Dylan improves the experience of 18XX quite a bit.
Oh, yeah?
Because, I mean, any game is more fun when you're just being like, laying track.
That's a good point.
Like, if I was saying, you know, like...
You're just saying he brings some energy to the train game.
He brings some energy, whereas instead of me just being like, I'm going to put a track here.
Yep.
You know, I wouldn't be having as much fun if I said that.
That's fair.
You got to approach it. You got to get the right energy and bring it into the game.
All right, that's fair enough. So he brings a little bit of excitement to the boring train games. That's what I'm hearing. All right.
Yeah.
So if you've been wondering about this game sitting on the table, that is not a train game. I was leaving it towards the end because I didn't want to spoil anything. But we're definitely going to be talking about Pipeline soon. I think it's going to be in our upcoming full-length episode with all 4 of us,
right,
from Origins. We're going to do a two-part episode of our recap of Origins.
We got a lot to talk about.
We have a lot to talk about. Holy crap. Yeah, it's going to be insane. And I demoed this game a lot at the Capstone booth. So yeah, it's going to be crazy fun. I think honestly, this is something that all of us could maybe enjoy, just from an economic game standpoint. I think there is some like worker placement in it, but I honestly, the economic side and a little bit of the, I guess you could maybe call it route building, but it feels a little bit different than that. But when you're like connecting your pipes and whatnot, should be pretty interesting. I don't know. It's quite a heavy economic game that, you know, like intro of my show says, but it's definitely going to be something to talk about at some point, I'm sure.
Right. Well, you're probably very good at teaching it by now, I would assume.
Oh yeah, I got it down. I mean, I can breeze through it. And honestly, it definitely feels like it's touching that that surface of the way Splotter feels in a lot of ways, where the rules are fairly simple and very straightforward, where it's just like you go here and you do this thing. Right. But then the depth of the decision space and the strategy is where the game really shines and kind of gets a little bit more complex. Or not complex, but it makes you really think and try to dive deep into what you might be wanting to do. So yeah, I'm super excited to talk about it. But was also super excited to have you on the podcast today. So I really appreciate you coming on, joining me. Anything else you'd like to share? Anything going on in your life that you think's that has interested you?
Anything going on in my life that has interested me?
That is just that has really like made an impact or made a difference that you thought was willing to share.
I'm going to say that I've been really tempted by miniatures war games lately, and I have to stay strong.
Come on,
because I don't have the money for that.
Yeah, it's like diving back into magic. You can't do that. Don't do that. Don't do it, Scott. That's the wrong part of the dark side. Okay, that's the wrong part. What? Just because I'm curious, what particular miniatures game are you thinking? Or is catching your eye?
Like I've just been looking at a few like historical miniatures games, like Hail Caesar or Flames of War, or something like that.
Gotcha. Are those new or like really old, or what's?
I mean, they're not exactly new, but they're still like pretty popular. Like those are a couple of the big ones.
Gotcha. Okay. Cool. All right. Well, I think that wraps up this episode. So thank you all for tuning in. If you haven't checked us out on social medias, we've got Facebook, Twitter. That's mostly it, I guess.
Facebook and Twitter. Yep. We have our own website too.
We do have our own website, cardboardrealitypodcast.com. Make sure to check us out over there. We've got written articles going up on the site all the time. We're putting our videos up there. So like this video will be on there, but it's really just a direct link to YouTube. Spoiler. A little behind the scenes look there. But yeah, thank you all for tuning in. Thanks for joining me, Scott. Appreciate it.
No problem. See you later, everyone.
Bye.